Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Thursday, March 26th, and I'm doing an update today on the astrology of the coronavirus. I've been receiving a lot of messages across all my social media platforms, essentially from people saying, is there any end in sight? What does the trajectory of this thing look like? When will I get back to work? I've been honestly avoiding making this video because I'm a very fallible astrologer. I get some things right. I don't always get everything right. You know what I mean? So it feels sort of daunting to try to make a statement about these these things because a lot of people listen to an astrologer and just put total faith into what they say, and I'm fallible. So I just have wanted to really sit with it, really think about it, feel into it, spend a couple of weeks, in isolation, really allowing the coronavirus dynamic in the world to kind of settle into the heart space a little bit before saying much more. You may notice in my videos a couple of weeks ago, I did a video on the astrology of the coronavirus that was predictive. It was a horary chart based on the trajectory of the coronavirus in the United States that has turned out to be absolutely and unfortunately true so far. It was not a rocket science prediction, like some brilliant, dazzling prediction. It basically just said things are going to get a lot worse. The signifier of the people of the United States was about to enter its fall into the sixth house of illness, misfortune, and disease. After picking up a translation of light from the moon through Jupiter, which represented the virus. So it was not a good looking horary. And I just said at the beginning of March, when the numbers were still really low, that I think this was going to get a lot worse. I had said as much in my Jupiter-Pluto video. If you look back at that one, just kind of saying, look, when Jupiter conjoins Pluto at the beginning of April, I think this thing has the potential to be really sort of blown up and really intense. So some of these things I've already said, but people are now asking me a lot for clarification. Could you just say something about what this looks like going forward? I am going to do that. Also today, I have some spiritual advice that I'm giving people about this. If you want to check out my new Bhakti Yoga channel, I have a private channel that is devoted to just the spiritual teachings of Bhakti Yoga, which may or may not be helpful to you right now, but I invite you to check that out if you're interested in it. It's available to people who join my newsletter. When you join my newsletter, you'll get on a mailing list every day, and those private videos are put out through that mailing list. Today, I'll be talking about the nature of spiritual medicine, how you can tell the difference between a spiritual cure and a kind of temporary material band-aid, and some of the differences as explained by the Bhagavad Gita. We'll be talking about some other topics that might be interesting. So check that out. And I also did a video introducing what is Bhakti Yoga. So all that has started, for those of you who are interested. Now, today in this video, what I want to do is give you a sense of where the astrology is heading in relation to the coronavirus, in my, opinion, my best educated guess as an astrologer. But first, before I do that, I want to remind everybody of the moment that we're living in, which is a Saturn-Pluto moment. Now, many people have probably heard me talk at length already about Saturn and Pluto. If you go back again in my archives, you're also going to find a number of different videos on Saturn and Pluto that should give you a lot to think about if you haven't already listened to those videos, as well as one of the videos that was probably most important for this transit came during, in January, I did a panel talk on Pluto with quite an amazing lineup of professional astrologers, and we all talked about this transit, which astrologers have been talking about for quite some time now in relation to Pluto. I want to read you something that comes from Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche. About 10 years ago, when I first started doing astrology, I heard Richard Tarnas talk about 2020 and what a big year this was because of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And I started giving talks about this pretty early on in my career, maybe 3 or 4 years into my professional full-time career. So astrologers have been thinking about 2020 for a long time. And I want to read you a little bit from his book, Cosmos and Psyche, on the combination of Saturn and Pluto, just so you can have a quick reminder. But again, if you want to go back and listen to a lot of the old content I did, there's a lot more there as well. We will now examine the planetary cycle of Pluto with Saturn, which in important respects bears a resemblance to the Uranus-Pluto cycle. The nature of this resemblance seems to reflect the activated presence of the archetypal principle associated with the planet Pluto in both cycles. But how the Pluto archetype is activated during Saturn-Pluto alignment periods, and conversely, what second archetypal principle is empowered and intensified by the Pluto archetype, presents an altogether different picture. So first of all, he's comparing and contrasting Saturn and Pluto to Uranus and Pluto. Uranus and Pluto is what we were dealing with most of the first half of last decade, with the Arab Spring, with Occupy Wall Street, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and so many other things that happened that represented a kind of revolutionary and a period of revolution and upheaval. The conjunction between Uranus and Pluto happened in the 1960s, was the start of the last cycle. And that, of course, was also a similar moment of major cultural revolution. The 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, of course, the countercultural movement in the United States, and so forth. Uranus-Pluto he spends a good portion of this book describing, which I would recommend checking out if you're going to read this book, because then you get a sense of not only what we're dealing with right now with Saturn-Pluto, but also the major outer planetary configuration between Uranus and Pluto that we just went through in the past 10 years. Anyway, while the Uranus-Pluto periods consistently coincided with widespread revolutionary upheaval, intensified emancipatory impulses, and radical cultural innovation, the successive quadrature alignments of Saturn-Pluto cycle coincided with especially challenging historical periods marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction. Eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. An atmosphere of gravity and tension tended to accompany these 3 to 4 year periods, as did a widespread sense of epochal closure, the end of an era, the end of innocence, the destruction of an earlier mode of life that in retrospect may seem to have been marked by widespread indulgence, decadence, naivete, denial, and inflation. Profound transformation was a dominant theme, as with the Uranus-Pluto cycle, but here the transformation was through contraction, conservative reaction, crisis, and termination. Both the First World War and Second World War began in precise coincidence with virtually exact hard aspect alignments of Saturn and Pluto in August 1914 and September 1939, respectively. The most recent Saturn-Pluto alignment occurred in precise coincidence with the events of September 11th, 2001, the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York and the attack on the Pentagon in Washington, and the many events set in motion in its wake. Now, in the first half of September 2001, Saturn and Pluto were within 2 degrees of an exact opposition. Many astrologers had speculated, both in print and private, about what might take place during this alignment, including the strong possibility of terrorism. And within moments of the devastating attacks, most astrologers in the country were absolutely, convinced that this was an expression of Saturn-Pluto. And so you had a lot of astrologers writing about Saturn-Pluto around September 11th. So we have our next Saturn-Pluto moment right now. And what do you know? Astrologers everywhere have been talking about this for quite some time. Like I said, going back all the way to 2010 being the first time I heard about 2020 as a target date for the same kind of international collective contraction moment. Birth, yes, but often through a serious contractive, heavy kind of crisis energy, like the contractions of during labor before the birth. The vivid complex of qualities, emotions, and meanings connected with these grave events, the beginning of the 2 world wars, September 11th and its aftermath, and many other such events during periods of Saturn-Pluto alignments, fits with remarkable precision the synthesis of archetypal principles associated with those 2 planets in combination, expressed in their most extreme form, both negatively and positively. Profoundly weighty events of enduring consequence, violence or death on a massive scale, the irrevocable termination of an established order of existence, collective intensification of division, antagonism, or hostility, the deployment of massive, highly disciplined, carefully organized destructive power, and a widespread sense of victimization and suffering under the impact of cataclysmic or oppressive forces of history. More generally, This archetypal complex tended to constellate a widespread sense that one's life was determined and constrained by large impersonal forces of many kinds. How about a virus? Historical, political, military, social, economic, judicial, biological, elemental, instinctual, too powerful and dominant to be affected by the individual self. This sense of vulnerability was in turn regularly matched by a drive for power, control, and domination. Sometimes the two sides of this larger gestalt were constellated simultaneously in two opposing persons or groups, one predatory, the other victimized. Yet, just as often, the two sides were constellated simultaneously within the same person, group, or nation, each part of the complex unconsciously eliciting the other. Experiences of deep humiliation caused by violence, violation, and defeat were thus often accompanied by a compensatory need to prove one's steely strength, invulnerability, and capacity to retaliate with lethal potency. Saturn-Pluto alignment periods are also characterized by displays of personal and collective determination, unbending will, courage, and sacrifice, by intensely focused, silent, strenuous effort in the face of danger and death, by a deepening capacity for moral discernment born from experience and suffering, and by the transformation and forging of enduring structures, whether material, political, or psychological. Listen to that again. I mean, seriously, like I've had to just take that in 3 or 4 times since the coronavirus epidemic has really started sweeping the world, because it really helps to ground ourselves in an understanding of the archetypal forces that shape the collective, with the outer planets are often associated with, right? Because they have interrupted the personal so fundamentally for all of us right now, that it's important to just listen to those archetypal descriptions again of Saturn and Pluto and say, yes, I'm living through a moment of historical global contraction right now. It's a coming of age moment, Saturn. It's a death and rebirth moment, Pluto. Fundamental structures of society are being challenged or destroyed or dismantled or temporarily shut down, Saturn and Pluto. It's a sobering moment. There's distance, there's isolation, Saturn. There's a sense of something invisible and oppressive, a virus, right? These are, and there's a great recession, contractive moment in the markets. These moments many other generations have lived through, of course. We hear people saying this, reminding us of this right now. World War II, World War I, the Great Depression, even recently September 11th, many other historical Saturn-Pluto moments. But this is par for the course in terms of the archetypes that are at play. And so I'm going to go into the dynamics of both Saturn and Pluto this year, as well as Jupiter and Pluto, try to map out something of a timeline. But I wanted to read that first because it's just a simple reminder of the moment that we're living in. This is a moment of historical contraction. And it's more important in such a moment than it is to be anxious about when will this end? When will these collective forces that feel like they're stripping me of something of my personal dignity or agency or sovereignty, rather than thinking when will they end, what's important to think is, where does my actual power lie? Is it just that when the economy stops working that I feel stripped of agency? You know, that's a pretty weak sense of agency. Not saying that I feel vulnerable too. I feel freaked out by it too. I want it to be over too. So I'm not saying I'm above it, but it is pretty, what ancient astrologers told us was that our agency has to do with our consciousness and the freedom that we find within how we respond, especially to the confining moments of fate. And of course, it's another way of saying that our happiness is not ultimately determined by the ups and downs of fortune, by the turning of the wheel of fortune, which cyclically includes great moments of contraction and meltdown societally, governmentally, economically, in terms of the seasons of the year that these rhythms are there. You know, as people on our brothers and sisters on the southern hemisphere are going into winter right now, we're coming out into spring, you know, so it's they're going in, I guess they're going into fall, we're going into spring. So these rhythms are built into nature, and yet we are so unconsciously aware of the way in which we, by overly identifying with the cycles of fortune, define our sense of happiness according to their circles and cycles. And so, the moment that the real important question right now, which I don't mean to sound, preachy, because I also am doing this video because I empathize with the anxiety that's out there 100%, but it's so important right now that we be holding out our hands and saying, what am I to receive from this moment? Not when does it end, but what is here for me now? And we can't, Maya, this is in my video on Bhakti today, I'm talking about Maya. Maya being the illusory energy of the material world, the cycles and circles that we get identified with and then lost in. But Maya also means mercy. And for the soul that has surrendered, the soul that has started to take itself off from that cycle and that loop, all of the ups and downs we receive with open hands as mercy. We see these ups and downs as adding unto us in our spiritual life. We have to, that shift of perception doesn't come unless in moments like this, for as much as we're anxious, we pull back to our center and say, I'm here. What is this collective moment doing for me? How is it serving my spiritual growth? We don't have to make some crazy, aggrandized story about how we're all leveling up right now spiritually. It's a humble thing that happens in quiet moments of everyday life right now. Simple question, are you taking time? Am I taking time to sit down and say, dear coronavirus, dear nature, dear Mother Earth, dear God, dear universe, what am I to see right now? What am I to learn? How would you have me serve with whatever resources I have those who are suffering? Or how can I be a servant in this moment rather than only being concerned about when my illusory sovereignty comes back? And one of the things we have to be so careful of is of avoiding that right now through total addiction to information. When is it going to end? What are the numbers? How fast is it going to spread? Blah, blah, blah. Even astrology that's too freaked out about it, not helpful, right? Not helping us take the posture of open arms, open hands, open heart. So, the information or Netflix or watching TV shows or just keeping ourselves occupied by stuffing our face and eating and worrying and social texting and all this stuff. All of that is fine. We're social animals. It's natural to also be concerned. But are we taking time every day to, there's a meme that's going around. You've probably seen it. And everyone's probably seen it by now. And it says, I feel like Mother Earth, I think it is, sent us all to our rooms to think about what we've done. And why is that so funny? It's funny because it's true. You know what I mean? So we need to make sure that we are, not in a punitive sense, but that we are kind of going to our rooms, the room of the heart, the room of quiet moments, to really deeply receive what this moment is, what this moment is giving. It's not the same. It's not, well, don't you realize what a jacked up civilization it is? Don't you realize how terrible environmental abuse has been? It's not something in the negative. That's there, of course. Maybe this is revealing to us some faults and flaws, fine. But be careful of the voice that reveals everything to you in the negative right now. If we sit down with hearts to receive and say, please bless me with understanding, what is this? The voice that comes in will be in the positive. It'll say, this is who you actually are. This is what happiness actually is. This is what actually looks like health. This is what actually looks like love, like friendship, like grace, like mercy. If we sit to receive, you should feel like something is being added to your understanding right now. So be careful of sitting back from a critical distance and judging the situation, even though there are many layers of judgment available to us right now, right? There's many ways in which we can judge what's happening in the world and say, problem, problem, problem. But to receive what's going on, we need to find a receptive position so that mercy can flow in and so that our hearts can be filled, right? And that's not there unless we're getting out of the hamster wheel of our anxiety about when our sovereignty will be uninterrupted. When does it come back and I'm no longer being bothered by this situation. So that's my first piece of advice. What did you expect? So if you like listening to my channel for something, then you like hearing this kind of stuff, I guess. So anyway, I'm going to show you now the transits, and let's talk, let's talk practically now about what we think of this timeline, what's coming. So again, I am not infallible as an astrologer. So these are my best educated guesses about what's going to happen. And first, what I want to do is tell you that this is a situation, this is a conversation that is happening between Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. So I'm going to remove everything from the view except for those three players. Now, what I want to do is show you what we're looking at. In the next couple of weeks, you're going to see Jupiter conjoin with Pluto. Between now and say the 4th to 5th of April, Jupiter's conjoining with Pluto. You would probably expect a proliferation because Jupiter represents abundance, and a kind of explosion or pretty intense catharsis of depth, intensity, darkness, etc. In the next couple of weeks. So that tells me that in the next couple of weeks, this epidemic is going to spike significantly, at least in the countries where it's not yet contained or the curve isn't flattening. I think the US in particular is going to have a really, overwhelming, display of the virus spreading. Why? Because Jupiter is in its fall. Jupiter represents growth, but what's growing? Saturn and Pluto stuff, right? So what's growing is the historical contractive crisis. That's what's spreading. Also, the power of Pluto, the dark, the invisible, the unseen, the underworld. That is the description of the virus. Pluto Jupiter is like something cancerous or malignant that's growing. Or at the best, it's also about that which grows in the shade, which can be the life of the soul, the realizations that are born in quiet, dark, shadowy places, which is, the womb is like that, right? So this could be seen as a transformational portal of consciousness. I want to be upbeat about that, but make no mistake about it, it also is definitely a picture of the more widespread proliferation and growth or abundance, Jupiter, of darker or more intense Plutonian things. That's going to intensify the first week of April. Now, I would say, hey, you know what? This looks pretty good because then Jupiter starts separating and Pluto turns retrograde, and all of that could mean that, yeah, look, by the end of May, Jupiter's 3 degrees off from Pluto. They've got some distance. Pluto's turned retrograde, maybe a turn of the tide coming. But then you have Jupiter turning retrograde and Saturn turning retrograde, and they're all heading back towards Pluto. Now, best case scenario would be that the return of both Saturn and Jupiter over Pluto means that in the wake of recovering from this worldwide epidemic, the markets are really struggling to get back on track, that there's a lot of recovery that has to be done, and it's a long process. So best case scenario would be by July, as Jupiter is late June, early July, as Jupiter is passing back over the conjunction to Pluto, that we're seeing some kind of restoration effort. But the more not so great interpretation would be a second wave. Now, Saturn coming back close to Pluto, luckily within 3 degrees by August. Jupiter's backed off by about 5 degrees then. I've got to think that things are toning down a little bit by late summer. But then again, it's really intense because then by late summer, Saturn's back within 3 degrees of Pluto. And you've got that really intense contractive transformational energy there by the end of the summer. And then Jupiter turns direct, and Jupiter's going to go right back into conjunction with Pluto. And that happens by about the middle of November, at which point Saturn and Pluto are still pretty closely conjoined. And then the two planets, they finally start pushing off from Pluto by the beginning of December. And then I think we have a totally different scenario. It's a lot more hopeful by the winter solstice. That's the time at which we see Jupiter and Saturn conjoining in Aquarius. Jupiter-Saturn has been known for thousands of years in their conjunctions to be moments of great, new, promising, hopeful chapters beginning, oftentimes in terms of government or the larger structures and leadership of society. So some renewal, some promise, some rebirth looks really good by this winter solstice. Up until then, on one level, I just want to be like, look, all bets are off. You've got three more. Oh, let's see. You've got one coming up in April, 2 in July, and then a third by the end of the year of Jupiter passing over Pluto. And that right now is being expressed by the widespread proliferation of this disease. Then it backs off, and so that looks good. Then it comes back, right? And it does that a few times. So the most, I think, like ominous thing to say would be that there might be a few waves of this, but that by the end of the year, there's a significant corner is being turned. That would be the most, I think, kind of ominous, but with a positive ending. The other thing would be that, look, any of these upcoming retrogrades could mean that things start backing off by late May or into June. Maybe that's really a positive upcoming turning point. But then look, those retrogrades going back and forth, Saturn coming back, there's still a big contractive moment that we're working through here, getting things back into working order, picking up the economy. And there could be other contractive forces within civilization, not but to mention an election here in the United States, that we are dealing with that are more, we're contending with, that are more challenging. So because that's the case, I've been really hesitant to issue any real specific predictions about how long this lasts. I hope by showing it to you, you can see the predicament that a lot of astrologers are in right now. You see a back and forth with the major players, and you're going like, it doesn't really back off until December, you know? But on the other hand, the coronavirus is not the only thing happening in the world right now. The markets are being affected. So travel is being, I mean, so many things. There's a big election in place here in the United States. So it's very possible that, again, the historical contractive sort of labor pains continue all the way until the end of the year. You know, even if the coronavirus is contained in sort of the curve is flattened, as they say. So I will be, you know, hopefully unpacking this as the year goes on and getting clearer about it, and hopefully offering you clearer vision of what's to come. We'll get a lot clearer as we see what happens with Jupiter and Pluto in the beginning of April. That first week of April is real intense for Jupiter and Pluto. So keep our eye on that, and then maybe update in you know, the next couple of weeks again and see where things are at. So I reserve the right to sort of amend how I'm looking at this within the framework of the overall Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto dynamic. So let's keep our eyes on it together. In the meantime, I'd love to hear your stories. And the question that's on my heart right now is really, what are your personal realizations? Are you taking time every day to just get still and open your hands and sort of say, personally, not collectively, what's wrong with the world? Why is this all happening? How are we effed as a civilization? What, you know, just that grand comic book epic level of what's going on right now. But personally, what are you learning? I'm going to share one with you just to get the conversation started. And then in the comment section, hit me up, tell me what you're learning. Here's what I'm learning. I consider myself, I'm pretty monastic in the way that I live. Like, you know, even my wife pokes fun at me because this is not like the whole quarantine thing. I'm like, this is like my daily life. I wake up, I have my spiritual practice in the morning. I prepare what I'm going to do for the day. I meet with people. I read ancient treatises, you know what I mean? Like on spirituality and astrology. And then, you know, so I'm not like that tuned in to the world so much, except for through social media and stuff like that. And most of my close friendships are with people who are very similar to myself in this regard. So I have been in a habit of thinking that what I do is kind of in a spiritual camp over here. And I think it's very easy to do this. But when it comes to my career, I guess what I've been realizing as the markets sort of shut down all over the world is, even though I'm not a consumer of a lot of things in the world that I consider to be really troubling, right? Like, I don't know, like for me, I'm a vegetarian. So like, I don't know, like McDonald's or something like that. Or just, I don't know, just lots of stuff in the world that I don't really consume, that I don't really think is great to consume, that I have my opinions about, you know what I mean? And what I've been realizing is that, like, in ways that I don't understand, in ways that I can't comprehend, what I do as an astrologer and the way that I make my money in the world, as you know, it's a business, is intimately tied into a lot of areas of the market that I don't necessarily condone, or I see myself sometimes as like above or separate from. And I don't do that with, like, I don't consciously do that with any like real, like arrogant, like, oh, you know, but I just have been realizing lately, like, I'm so dependent upon the whole system working. You know what I mean? And I guess I only thought in my head, I kind of thought that what I did was sort of separate from the whole rest of the system. And as, you know, my own work is, you know, being affected, like so many people, I'm just realizing how dependent I am on the whole thing. And that connects me to things that sometimes I like to think of myself as kind of more evolved than, you know? And that's been very humbling for me to realize, but I'm so thankful for it as well because I don't know, it's just giving me more compassion and patience, I guess. So that's my little, I don't know, that's my little insight. And yeah, I feel a little bit vulnerable in sharing it, but um, it's just been a really good reminder of how interdependent my work is with so many other people who do other things, and what a humbling reminder it is that my work is dependent upon so many other people and what they do in the world. And I just never want to forget that. So anyway, what are you learning right now? I would love to hear from you. And I hope you're having a great week and that you're able to take some time to hold the hands out and receive, get off the hamster wheel of stuff that distracts you. And again, if you're interested in learning more about Bhakti Yoga, I'm making more content right now that's more directly about yoga philosophy, and I think yoga philosophy has a lot to offer us right now. So hopefully that will be of use to people as well. If you want to check that out again, you can join my newsletter on my website at nightlightastrology.com. Those videos are coming out on a private YouTube channel. Okay, take it easy, everyone. Bye.